Chapter 7. Into the lion's den the following evening arrived cold and clear, with only a thin veil of clouds drifting over the city. Conrad and Maggie were silent as they prepared for what could be the most dangerous night of their lives. At Maggie's apartment, they laid out the bare essentials: dark clothes, gloves, and a few pieces of specialized tech Conrad had borrowed from a trusted friend in the precinct who knew better than to ask questions. Conrad examined the modified burner phone Lawson had provided for coordinating with him. He tapped the screen, running through the plan again in his head. They would break into Rat's warehouse in Red Hook, locate the physical records Lawson believed were stashed there, and extract any damning evidence they could find. If they could get proof of Rat's direct involvement in corruption, even his most powerful allies wouldn't be able to shield him. Maggie zipped up her jacket, her face a mask of focus. "You think Lawson will actually show? After last night, I wouldn't blame him if he decided to sit this one out." Conrad nodded. "He'll be there. He knows we're running out of time. Besides, if Rats has people in the DA's office, Lawson's life is on the line just as much as ours." They left her apartment under cover of darkness, moving swiftly through back alleys and empty streets until they reached the industrial sprawl of Red Hook. The neighborhood was mostly deserted at this hour, the few scattered streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Conrad felt the cold bite at his skin as they approached the warehouse district. The faint hum of a car engine in the distance was the only sound as they slipped into an alley, crouching behind an abandoned delivery truck. A familiar figure emerged from the shadows. Lawson moved quickly to join them, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He nodded at them, his expression tense but determined. "I scoped out the place earlier," he whispered, glancing toward the warehouse entrance. "The main doors are heavily guarded, but there's a side entrance around back. 2 guards posted there, but if we're careful, we can slip past them." Conrad scanned the building. It was an old, windowless structure with faded signage, one of many in the area. It looked like any other forgotten warehouse, but he knew Rats was too smart to store something so valuable without taking precautions. They'd be walking straight into the heart of his operation. They moved quickly, hugging the building's wall as they circled toward the side entrance. The muffled voices of the guards drifted through the air, and they halted behind a stack of crates, waiting for the right moment. "Now," Conrad whispered, signaling Maggie. With smooth, practiced precision, she moved forward, silently taking down one of the guards with a quick sleeper hold while Conrad neutralized the other. They dragged the unconscious men into the shadows and moved toward the entrance. "Nice work," Lawson murmured, cracking the door open. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a dimly lit corridor lined with metal shelving and stacks of crates. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old cardboard. "Records should be in the lower levels," Lawson whispered, leading the way. "Rats keeps his most valuable files in a secure vault down there." They moved carefully, each step echoing in the empty halls. Conrad's senses were on high alert, his hand hovering near his holster as they descended a narrow staircase. At the bottom, a heavy metal door blocked their path, its surface scratched and rusted from years of use. Lawson produced a keycard, a small smile flickering across his face. Courtesy of an old contact who decided to switch sides. He slid the card through the reader, and the door clicked open, revealing a dimly lit room lined with metal filing cabinets and shelves packed with dusty ledgers. At the far end, a small, unmarked door stood closed, a vault, no doubt holding the physical records they were looking for. Maggie's face lit up as she moved toward the vault, setting up a small device to hack into its electronic lock. "This will take a minute," she murmured. "Stay sharp." Conrad kept his eyes on the door, listening for any sound of approaching footsteps. His pulse quickened, each second feeling longer than the last. He knew that if they were discovered now, they wouldn't make it out of the warehouse alive. The vault beeped, and the lock clicked open. Maggie shot them a triumphant look, pushing the door open to reveal shelves filled with neatly organized folders and boxes. Conrad and Lawson moved in, their eyes scanning the contents. Conrad's gaze landed on a thick folder labeled Priority Accounts. He grabbed it, flipping through pages of names, dates, and transaction amounts. The list included dozens of high-ranking officials, each one connected to Rat's operation in some way. Jackpot, Lawson whispered, grabbing another folder. This is it. This is the proof we need. Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. Conrad's stomach dropped. They'd been discovered. Grab what you can, he hissed, stuffing the files into a bag. We need to move, now. Maggie and Lawson scrambled to gather the evidence as the footsteps grew louder. Conrad peeked through the doorway, his heart pounding as he saw 3 armed guards approaching, guns drawn. He signaled for silence, motioning for them to move toward a narrow passage at the back of the vault. They slipped through just as the guards entered the room, their flashlights scanning the shelves. Conrad led them down the dark passage, moving quickly as the guards' voices echoed behind them. They must have taken something. Spread out and find them. They reached the end of the passage, emerging into a wide storage room filled with stacks of wooden crates. Conrad spotted a small ventilation window near the ceiling, an escape route. Up there, he whispered, gesturing to the window. They climbed onto the crates, one by one, until they reached the window. Conrad boosted Maggie through first, then Lawson, who gave him a tense nod as he climbed out. Just as Conrad was about to follow, a voice called out from behind him. Hold it right there, detective. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the man standing in the doorway, Dominic Vargas, Rats Malone's right-hand enforcer, his scarred face twisted into a malicious grin. Thought you could steal from the boss and walk out of here? Vargas sneered, pulling out a knife. You've made a big mistake, Decepto. Conrad took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had no choice, he needed to buy Maggie and Lawson time to get away. What's the matter, Vargas? Conrad taunted, his voice calm. Rat's afraid to do his own dirty work. Vargas' grin faded, replaced by a flicker of rage. You talk big, Decepto. But I know your type. You're just another suit with a badge, pretending to make a difference. Conrad took a step back, his hand brushing against a loose metal pipe on a nearby crate. He gripped it tightly, preparing for a fight. Funny coming from Rat's lapdog, he retorted, eyes locked on Vargas. You've spent your life hiding behind that scar, thinking it makes you look tough. But you're just a lackey. Vargas lunged, his knife glinting in the dim light. Conrad dodged, swinging the pipe with all his strength and catching Vargas across the jaw. The enforcer staggered back, momentarily dazed, and Conrad seized the moment to shove a stack of crates toward him, creating a makeshift barricade. Without looking back, Conrad leapt for the window, pulling himself through just as Vargas regained his balance. He dropped down into the alley, where Maggie and Lawson were waiting, their eyes wide with relief. Move! Conrad shouted, leading them down the alley as Vargas' shouts echoed from inside the warehouse. They sprinted through the narrow streets, ducking into shadows as headlights flashed nearby. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached Lawson's car, parked a few blocks away. They piled in, and Lawson floored the gas, speeding away from Red Hook. As they sped through the quiet streets, Conrad felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a sense of triumph. They had the evidence, and for the first time, they were one step ahead of Rats Malone. Lawson drove them to a secure location on the city's edge, where they would spend the night processing the files before taking them public. In the dim light of the car, Conrad caught Maggie's gaze, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. We did it, Conrad, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. We finally have enough to take him down. Conrad managed a faint smile, though he knew the battle was far from over. Rats Malone was wounded now, and there was no telling what he would do once he realized they had escaped with his most prized secrets. But for the first time, Conrad felt a spark of hope, a sense that, maybe, just maybe, they would survive this fight. Tomorrow, they would go to war. Chapter 8. Smoke and shadows. The morning light was cold and thin, filtering through the cracked windows of the abandoned building where Conrad, Maggie, and Lawson had spent the night poring over the Vermin list. They'd spread the documents across a scarred wooden table, organizing names, dates, transactions, an undeniable, tangible web connecting Rats Malone's empire to city officials, judges, police officers, and even high-profile business owners. Each piece of evidence was a nail in Rat's coffin, but the city was unpredictable, and Conrad knew that Rats would not go down without a vicious fight. After hours of work, they stepped away from the table to stretch and sip from their near-empty coffee cups. Conrad's mind was on alert, calculating their next steps, when Lawson's phone rang. The aider's face darkened as he answered, holding the phone to his ear with tense silence. A moment later, he hung up, looking grim. "That was my contact from the federal office," he said, voice tight. "We have a problem. Rats found out about the warehouse break-in, and he's mobilizing his people. He's already put the word out that he'll pay for information on our whereabouts. We're effectively the most wanted people in the city right now." "Great," Maggie muttered, rubbing her temples. "We've got enough to bury him, but now every lowlife in the city is looking to turn us in. Rat's probably called in every favor he has." Lawson nodded, running a hand over his face. "Worse than that, Rats has men embedded with the DA's office. My contact's already seen unusual movement there this morning, as if they're preparing to intercept us." Conrad slammed a fist against the table, rattling the carefully organized papers. "So, they're waiting for us to walk through the front door with the files. Rats is covering every angle. And here we are, with the evidence, but without a way to get it out safely." They were at an impasse, trapped by the very people they'd counted on for protection. Conrad's mind raced, looking for some other way out. They couldn't just disappear. They needed the entire city to see the Vermin list, to hear every name, and to feel the impact of Rat's betrayal. A careful leak wouldn't be enough. "What if we go public ourselves?" Maggie suggested. "I know a journalist at the New York Herald. She's reputable, and she hates organized crime. If we could get her involved, she could publish the list. The whole city would know before Rats could touch it." Lawson shook his head. "If we leak the list without the DA's office involved, it could be seen as a breach of evidence protocol. Rat's lawyers would claim it was falsified, just a smear campaign from disgruntled cops. We need an official platform that can back the evidence up." "Then we'll have to be the platform," Conrad said, a spark of determination in his voice. "Rats might own parts of the city, but he doesn't own the people. If we can release the list in a way that feels impossible to ignore, he won't have time to wrangle his influence. He'll have a PR nightmare on his hands, and the public outcry will put pressure on every judge, officer, and official to distance themselves from him." Lawson raised an eyebrow. "That's a big gamble, Conrad. And we'd need a way to get it in front of as many eyes as possible. Something undeniable, high profile." "An event," Maggie cut in, her eyes lighting up. "There's the police gala at the mayor's residence tonight, the one they throw every year to celebrate law enforcement. Every major political figure, every news network, they'll all be there." Conrad's mind raced. It was the perfect venue to blow Rat's empire wide open, but it would also mean they'd be risking exposure from the second they stepped through the doors. "The security there will be tight," he said slowly, "but if we're careful, we could stage it. Slip the documents into the hands of the right people before anyone realizes who we are. With the press already there, we wouldn't even need to speak, just drop it in their laps." Lawson crossed his arms, a hint of a smile playing at the edge of his mouth. "That might just work. If we can get the files into the hands of a few key journalists and city officials, they'll be forced to address it publicly. Rats can't pay off an entire gala full of reporters and cameras." "But it has to be flawless," Maggie said, her expression grave. "No hiccups, no second chances. If Rats gets wind of it before we're ready, we'll be lucky to leave the gala alive." Conrad looked at each of them in turn, seeing the resolve mirrored in their faces. This was the plan, as crazy as it sounded, and there was no turning back. They gathered the documents, carefully packing them into a slim briefcase Lawson would carry, along with a few electronic copies for backup. They left their temporary safe house under the cover of midday crowds, each aware that by nightfall, the city would either be on the brink of cleansing itself or plunging deeper into rats' control. Hours later, the trio arrived at the mayor's residence. The city's elite were already streaming through the doors, their chatter and laughter filling the air as cameras flashed, capturing the attendees in their formal attire. Conrad adjusted his collar, trying to shake the discomfort he felt in the rented tuxedo he and Lawson had managed to secure. Maggie, in a simple, dark evening gown, scanned the crowd as they moved through the entrance, subtly nodding to Conrad. He could see her eyes already marking the exits, taking note of the guests, officials, and potential allies. Inside, they blended with the other attendees, mingling cautiously as they waited for the right moment. Around them, police officials and city figures chatted over glasses of champagne, oblivious to the files held within inches of their fingertips. Lawson spotted Sarah Walker, the veteran journalist from the New York Herald who had covered the city's organized crime scene for years. She was at the center of a circle of reporters, laughing at something one of her colleagues had said. "Sarah's here," Lawson whispered to Conrad and Maggie. "If we can get the files into her hands, she'll know what to do. She's a bulldog. Once she gets her hands on this, she won't let go." "Then let's make it happen," Conrad replied, tightening his grip on the briefcase. They moved in her direction, careful to keep a low profile. Just as they reached her, however, the room quieted, and a heavy voice rang out. Conrad turned, his stomach twisting. There, at the top of the staircase, flanked by several security guards, stood none other than Johnny Rats Malone himself, dressed in an impeccable black suit, his beady eyes sweeping over the crowd with a confident smirk. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rats announced, his voice dripping with false charm, "it's an honor to join you all tonight, especially as we celebrate the brave men and women who keep our city safe." His gaze paused on Conrad for the briefest second, and Conrad saw a glimmer of recognition. Rats knew. Beside him, Maggie's breath hitched. "He's on to us," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "We need to move, now." Conrad nodded, his pulse racing as he leaned toward Sarah, who was watching Rats with a scowl. "Ms. Walker," he whispered urgently. She turned, surprised to see him so close. "You don't know me," he continued, "but I'm Detective Conrad Decepto. I have something you need to see. The whole city does." He pressed the slim briefcase into her hands. "Inside is everything you need to expose Johnny Rats Malone. Names, dates, transactions. Take it. And don't let anyone keep you from publishing it." Walker's eyes widened, her gaze darting to the briefcase. She hesitated, then nodded, a steely determination settling over her face. "If this is real, Detective, you have my word it'll be everywhere by morning." Just then, Conrad felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He turned to see one of Rat's enforcers, his face cold and expressionless. "Mr. Malone would like a word," the enforcer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Maggie stiffened, but Conrad gave her a subtle nod. "Go with Lawson. Make sure Walker gets out safely." She opened her mouth to protest, but she knew there was no other choice. Giving him one last look, she turned, blending into the crowd with Lawson, who had positioned himself between Sarah and any of Rat's men. They moved swiftly toward the exit, leaving Conrad alone with Rat's enforcer. Conrad was led to a small room off the main hall, where Rats waited, his smirk now gone. The two men locked eyes, and Rat's lip curled with disdain. "You made quite the mistake coming here tonight, Decepto," he sneered. "Handing files over to a reporter like some desperate rookie? You really think you're going to get away with this?" Conrad's voice was calm, steady. "It's over, Rats. Sarah Walker has the files, and she won't stop until everyone in this city knows who you are." Rat's eyes darkened. "You really don't get it, do you? I own this city. By tomorrow, any trace of that list will be gone, along with anyone fool enough to believe it. But as he spoke,